My dad left me $50 and a note. The bill was folded twice like he'd tried to make it look bigger than it was. The note was written on the back of an airline itinerary, blue ink, hurried the letters slanting like he'd written it while walking. "We're going to Europe for a month." "No, I'm sorry. No, we'll miss you." No instructions. Just that sentence and the faint smell of his cologne on the paper, like proof he'd been standing in my doorway for a second before disappearing again. I was 12. I remember the exact weight of the silence after the front door shut. Not the dramatic kind of silence you hear in movies, just an ordinary house quiet that suddenly felt wrong. The refrigerator hummed. A ceiling fan clicked. Somewhere outside, a lawn sprinkler ticked like a clock, pretending everything was normal. I stood in the hallway holding the note like it might change if I stared long enough. My room was still half packed from the argument the night before. My backpack lay open on the carpet, textbooks spilling out, a half-finished science project leaning against my dresser. I'd been told to stop being dramatic when I asked what I was supposed to do while they were gone. My dad's eyes had flashed with irritation, not guilt. My mom had sighed as if my existence was one more item she hadn't scheduled properly. "You're old enough," she'd said. "Don't make this a thing." Europe was a word that sounded like perfume ads and glossy magazines. It didn't belong in our kitchen. It didn't belong over my cereal bowl the next morning when the house felt too large for one kid to carry. I walked into the kitchen because my body didn't know where else to go. The light above the sink was on, someone had left it on. That tiny detail bothered me more than it should have. Like they'd had time to flip a switch, but not time to look me in the eye and say, "We're leaving you alone." The counter was clean. Too clean. No dirty plates, no coffee ring, no banana peel. My parents loved leaving a mess when they wanted me to know I was there to pick up after them, but today there was nothing. They'd prepared for their trip with the kind of discipline they never applied to being my parents. I found the calendar on the fridge with their neat handwriting dates circled, Flight 7:10 a.m. Hotel Check-in Tour Dinner Res. My name was nowhere on it. The $50 bill lay on the table like a joke. I sat down and unfolded it again, smoothing the crease with my thumb. $50. For groceries, for emergencies, for a month of pretending I didn't need anyone. At 12, you don't understand what abandonment is. You understand hunger. You understand the way your stomach tightens when you hear a car slow down outside and then speed up again. You understand the cold panic of walking through a quiet house at night and hearing a sound that could be a pipe shifting or a stranger at the window. I stared at the phone on the wall. It had a long cord and buttons that clicked loudly. I thought about calling my grandmother, but my father hated her. He said she filled my head with nonsense, which usually meant she treated me like a human being. I thought about calling a neighbor, but my mom didn't like the neighbors. She didn't like anyone who might ask questions she didn't want to answer. So I did what kids like me always do. I tried to make myself small enough to fit into the cracks of other people's lives without causing inconvenience. I poured cereal and added water because we were out of milk. I told myself it wasn't bad. I told myself I liked it that way. I chewed slowly, like my mouth could convince my brain this was normal. After breakfast, I walked through the house and checked doors the way I'd seen my dad do at night, front door locked, back door locked, windows shut. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just knew the emptiness made me feel exposed. My dad always said the world was dangerous. He loved danger as an idea. He used it as an excuse to control everything, to lecture me about how I should dress, who I should talk to, what I should dream about. But when it came time to actually protect me, he handed me $50 and boarded a plane. I went to school that day because school was predictable. There were bells, rules, and adults who at least pretended to care if you didn't show up. I didn't tell anyone. That's something people don't always understand about kids who grow up in houses like mine. You don't announce the chaos. You hide it, not because you're proud, but because you're afraid someone will look at your life and decide you don't deserve privacy. At school, I smiled when I was supposed to. I laughed at jokes I didn't hear. I wrote my answers on worksheets with the same neat handwriting my mother insisted on, like good penmanship could cover the fact that my home life was falling apart. When the last bell rang, I walked home slowly, dragging my feet through fallen leaves. I remember watching other kids climb into cars where moms asked, "How was your day?" like it mattered. I watched dads toss backpacks into trunks, heads bent close to listen. I watched families move together like they were connected by something invisible and strong. I didn't know what that felt like, not really. My house looked the same from the outside. Beige siding, trimmed bushes, 2 steps up to the porch. It was the kind of house people would point to and say, nice neighborhood. It was the kind of house that made teachers assume everything inside was stable. I let myself in, and the quiet hit me again thicker now because it was late afternoon, and the sun made long shadows across the floor. My voice sounded strange when I said hello, even though I knew no one would answer. I opened the fridge and saw 3 eggs, a jar of pickles, and half a bottle of ketchup. My mother had bought wine for the trip, 2 bottles still there, sitting like they had more right to be in that fridge than I did. I ate crackers for dinner and told myself it was an adventure. I told myself I was grown up. I told myself I didn't care. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle. I clutched the note like it was a map, the only proof I hadn't imagined it. I could see the words in my head even with my eyes closed. We're going to Europe for a month. I thought about what a month meant. 4 weeks, 28 to 31 days. Enough time for a kid to change. Enough time for something to happen that can't be undone. And somewhere in that darkness, something inside me shifted. Not with anger, not yet, but with a quiet, steady realization. If I didn't take care of myself, no one else would. That was the first lesson I ever learned that later fit inside the Marine Corps. Not the loud ones, not the ones men shout about honor and courage. The first lesson was silence. The first lesson was survival. And I didn't know it then, but the moment my father left that note on my table, he started a chain reaction. He would one day stand in front of and gasp. Because there are some things you can't do to a child and expect her to stay a child forever. By the 3rd day, the $50 didn't feel like money anymore. It felt like a countdown. I learned quickly which sounds meant normal house and which ones meant something's wrong. The refrigerator hum was normal. The soft thump of the air conditioner turning on was normal. The sharp crack of a branch against the window at night was not. I slept with my bedroom door locked, even though my father used to mock people who did that. Locks are for honest people, he'd say, like he was proud of being fearless. But courage isn't leaving a 12-year-old alone for a month and calling it independence. Courage is showing up. Courage is staying. I kept going to school. I kept my face smooth and my voice even. I mastered the art of answering questions without giving information. "How's your mom?" a teacher asked when I yawned in class. "She's fine," I said. Because fine could mean anything. Fine could mean in another country. Fine could mean I haven't heard her voice in days. Fine could mean I ate crackers for dinner again. At home, I began making rules for myself. Not because anyone told me to, but because rules made the chaos feel smaller. Rule 1, doors locked by sunset. Rule 2, keep the lights on in the kitchen until you've eaten something. Rule 3, never answer the door unless you can see who it is. Rule 4, if something breaks, don't cry. Fix it. If you can't fix it, hide it. The first thing that broke was the bathroom sink. The handle turned and suddenly water wouldn't stop running. I stood there staring at it, heart pounding, because I could already hear my dad's voice in my head. "What did you do?" But I hadn't done anything. That was the point. Things happened and no one was there to handle them but me. I crawled under the cabinet and found the shutoff valve. I remembered seeing a plumber do it once. I twisted until my knuckles hurt and the water slowed, then stopped. The silence afterward was so loud I had to sit on the tile floor and breathe through the panic. I was 12, but my body didn't get to be 12. My body got to be responsible. I rationed food like I'd seen people do in documentaries. I ate whatever was there, first bread heels, old cereal, canned soup with dents in the tin. I learned to fill my stomach with water so the hunger didn't feel like a roar. I didn't tell anyone because telling someone would mean questions. Questions would mean adults. Adults would mean someone might come to the house and see that the fridge was empty and the laundry was piled and the only parent in the building was a kid with a note on an itinerary. And if that happened, I didn't know what they'd do with me. I'd heard stories. Foster homes, group homes, strangers. You don't need to understand the system to understand fear. So I became my own system. One afternoon, a white envelope appeared in the mailbox. No return address that mattered to me. Inside was a postcard with a picture of a cathedral and my mother's handwriting looping across the back. "Having a wonderful time. Weather is beautiful. Don't forget to feed the fish." We didn't have fish. I stared at that line until my eyes burned. It wasn't the mistake that hit me, it was what the mistake meant. She hadn't thought about me long enough to remember what lived in our house. She was sending me a postcard the way you send one to a neighbor who waters your plants. A task, a reminder, not love. I folded it and put it in my backpack like proof I wasn't making this up. Like evidence I could show someone later if I ever needed to justify why I had become the way I was becoming. That evening I heard a knock at the door. I froze in the hallway, my heart beat loud in my ears. The knock came again, firmer this time, followed by a woman's voice. "Sweetie, it's Mrs. Calder." She was the neighbor across the street. Silver hair, soft sweaters, the kind of person who always seemed to be baking something. My mother smiled at her on the sidewalk and complained about her behind closed doors. I didn't move. "Your parents' car hasn't been here," she continued through the door voice, gentle but watchful. "I just wanted to check on you." I backed away like her kindness was a threat. Kindness was dangerous because it made you want things. It made you want to lean into someone and let them carry the weight. But if you leaned and they dropped you, the fall hurt worse. "I'm fine," I called, forcing brightness into my voice. They're busy." There was a pause. "Are you alone?" No, I lied too quickly. Another pause longer. I imagined her face on the porch, the way her eyes would narrow with concern. "I made extra chicken pot pie," she said finally. "I can leave a plate on the step." "I'm not hungry," I said. "That's okay," she replied, still calm. "I'll leave it anyway." I waited until her footsteps faded before I unlocked the door a crack. A covered dish sat on the doormat, still warm. The smell hit me and my stomach twisted so hard I had to grip the doorframe. I carried it inside like contraband. I ate, standing over the sink, swallowing too fast, terrified that letting myself enjoy it would make me cry. It was the first real meal I'd had since they left, and it tasted like something I didn't deserve. Afterward, I washed the dish 3 times, not because it was dirty, but because scrubbing gave my hands something to do besides shake. The next day, I returned it with a note that said, "Thank you. We're fine. My mom says thanks too." I hated myself for writing my mother into it like she had any right to claim credit for someone else's care. But if I didn't write her into it, Mrs. Calder might keep asking questions. Questions were dangerous. Still, the pot pie changed something. It reminded me that people were watching. Not enough to save me maybe, but enough to notice if I slipped. So I tightened my routine. I set an alarm to wake up early and do laundry before school so my clothes wouldn't smell. I took shorter showers to make the water heater last. I learned which lights in the house could stay off so the electric bill wouldn't spike. I didn't know how bills worked, but I knew my father loved control and numbers, and I didn't want to give him another excuse to blame me. At night, I sat at the kitchen table with my homework spread out like a shield. I practiced being normal. I practiced being invisible. Somewhere in the middle of the second week, I started hearing my father's voice in my head, less, and my own voice more. It was quiet, but it was there. "You handled the sink. You got to school. You didn't fall apart." And then, because the world has a cruel sense of timing, the power went out during a storm. The house went black. The wind threw rain against the windows like gravel. The silence in the darkness wasn't empty, it was alive. I stood in the living room breathing hard and realized something with absolute clarity. If I panicked, no one would come. So I didn't. I found a flashlight in the hall closet, the batteries half dead but working. I lit a candle in the kitchen like I'd seen my grandmother do during hurricanes. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet and waited out the storm with my knees tucked to my chest, the flame trembling but steady. That night in the flickering light, I understood what my parents had actually given me. Not freedom. Not strength. They'd given me the necessity of becoming my own adult. By the time the power came back, I wasn't a child waiting for her parents anymore. I was a kid learning how to survive their absence. And as the days crawled toward the end of that month, I began to feel something new under the fear, something sharper, colder. Not sadness. Not even anger. A question that kept tapping at the back of my mind like a steady drumbeat. When they come back, what exactly do they think they're coming back to? Because the house looked the same from the street. The bushes were trimmed. The porch light still worked. The curtains still hung. But inside something had changed. Inside I had changed. And I didn't know yet what my father was going to see when he finally walked through that door, but I knew with the calm certainty that would one day fit perfectly under a Marine Corps cover that whatever it was going to hit him like a blow. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the air washed clean and sharp. Sunlight cut through the windows like nothing bad had happened, like the house hadn't held its breath with me in the dark the night before. I made it to school on time, my shoes still damp at the edges, my backpack heavier with books and things I didn't talk about. I started marking days on the calendar with a pencil dot so small it almost didn't exist. 1 dot for each night I got through. I didn't cross them out. Crossing felt like tempting something. I just marked them and moved on. At 12, you learn that time doesn't move evenly. Some days sprint, others crawl on their knees. The last week before they came back stretched thin, every hour rubbing against my nerves. I felt watched, even when I was alone, like the house itself knew the ending was coming. I cleaned without being told. Not because the place was dirty, but because order felt like armor. I wiped fingerprints from light switches. I lined up shoes by the door. I folded blankets tight enough to bounce a coin. My father loved things neat. He loved walking into a room and seeing proof that people had behaved. I didn't know why I cared. Maybe part of me still wanted him to approve of something. Maybe I wanted to control the moment he came home to decide what story the house would tell before he opened his mouth. The night before their return, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator hum the same sound as the first day, but now it felt different. Familiar, almost reassuring. I wondered if I should be excited. That's what kids are supposed to feel when their parents come home. Instead, my stomach felt hollow and tight, like I was bracing for impact. I woke before the alarm and stood in the hallway holding the note one last time. The ink had smudged where my fingers had touched it too often. "We're going to Europe for a month." The words looked smaller now, less important. I folded it carefully and slipped it into the back of my dresser drawer beneath my socks. Not to hide it, to keep it. The car pulled into the driveway just after noon. I heard it before I saw it, the crunch of tires on gravel, the familiar squeak of the passenger door. My heart kicked hard, then settled into something steady and cold. I didn't run to the window. I didn't stand by the door. I stayed where I was sitting at the kitchen table with my homework open pencil resting across the page. I wanted to meet them the way they'd left me, unannounced, unprepared, alone. The front door opened and closed. Luggage wheels rattled across the entryway. "Honey," my mom called, her voice bright and travel light, like she'd left all her worries somewhere over the ocean. I didn't answer right away, not to punish her, just because I needed one more breath. Then I said, "I'm in the kitchen." They came in together. My dad first, shoulders broad-faced, tanned sunglasses still perched on his head like a trophy. My mom followed, scarf loose around her neck, hair styled in that effortless way she saved for other people. My father stopped just inside the doorway. I saw it immediately. The pause, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he scanned the room. Nothing was wrong, that was the problem. The counters were clean, the sink empty, no dishes piled, no trash overflowing, the floor swept. The calendar still on the fridge, but the pencil dots were so small he didn't notice them. You're here," my mom said like it was a pleasant surprise. I looked up from my homework. "School's out early today." She nodded, distracted, already turning to set her bag down. My dad didn't move. He kept looking not at me but past me, as if he expected to see something else emerge from the corners. A babysitter. A mess. Proof that his absence had mattered. "You didn't call," he said. "You didn't ask me to," I replied. The words landed between us heavier than they sounded. My mom laughed softly, trying to smooth it over. "She's fine. See, I told you." My father stepped farther into the kitchen. His gaze dropped to the table, the neatly stacked mail, the homework laid out with military precision. He frowned, not pleased, not angry, confused. "What did you eat?" he asked. "Food." "What kind of food?" "Whatever was here." He opened the fridge, then froze. I watched his reflection in the stainless steel door as his face changed. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the mouth, a slight inhale through the nose. "What happened to the groceries?" he asked. My mom stepped beside him. "We just shopped before we left." There were some things, I said evenly. I ate them. "For a month," he snapped. I shrugged, not careless, not defiant, just factual. "That's how long you were gone." He shut the fridge harder than necessary and turned to me fully now. His eyes traveled over me like he was taking inventory, checking for damage, bruises, weight loss, something obvious he could point to and explain away. "You didn't cause any trouble, did you?" he said. The question stunned me, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed everything. His first concern wasn't how I'd been. It was whether my existence had inconvenienced him in his absence. "No," I said. He let out a breath, relieved. Good. "That was when it happened." He noticed the calendar. Not the pencil dots, but the dates. The careful way everything had been kept. The way the house felt occupied but controlled, like someone competent had been there. His gaze shifted back to me slower this time. "You stayed here alone," he said. "Yes." "For the whole month?" "Yes." My mom opened her mouth, closed it again. My father's face drained of color in a way I'd never seen before. Not white, not pale, just empty. Like the blood had quietly left without asking permission. "No," he said under his breath. He looked around again, this time with something like fear. Not fear of what had happened, but fear of what hadn't. No police, no calls, no neighbors on the porch, no disaster to justify his choice. "No," he repeated louder, "this can't be happening." My mom touched his arm. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on me now, sharp and searching. "What did you do?" he demanded. I met his stare without blinking. I lived here. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space, steady and indifferent. My father swallowed, his mouth opened then closed again. "No," he said again, almost pleading this time. "No, this isn't right." I didn't understand it then, not fully. But I understand it now. He wasn't shocked that I'd survived. He was shocked that I hadn't needed him to do it. That realization hit him like a physical blow, and I watched him take a step back as if the floor had shifted under his feet. Because in that moment, something he'd believed about himself, about control, about importance, about being necessary, had cracked. And cracks have a way of spreading. I didn't know yet how far this one would go. I only knew that the child he'd left behind no longer existed. And whatever stood in front of him now was something he hadn't planned for. Something he didn't understand. Something that would one day stand much straighter in a different uniform and look him in the eye with the same calm certainty. But that day was still ahead. For now there was just the kitchen. The silence. And my father staring at the evidence of his own absence, finally beginning to grasp what it had cost him. After that day the house filled up again, but it didn't feel fuller. It felt tighter, like the walls had learned a new shape and didn't want to stretch back. My parents unpacked their souvenirs on the dining table. Magnets, scarves, a small glass figurine wrapped in tissue paper. They talked about trains and cafes and how expensive everything was, their voices overlapping, eager to be heard. I listened from the hallway, unseen, counting breaths the way I had during the storm. No one asked how I slept. No one asked what I ate. No one asked what it was like to be 12 and alone for a month. My father watched me instead, not openly. He'd glance up when I walked into a room, then look away too quickly. He began correcting small things, how I stacked the dishes, how I folded laundry, like he was trying to reclaim territory he hadn't realized he'd surrendered. "You don't have to do that," he said once, seeing me wipe the counter after dinner. I know I replied and kept wiping. That bothered him more than if I'd stopped. At night, I lay in bed listening to them move through the house, doors opening, drawers sliding. Their presence was louder than their absence had ever been. I missed the quiet, and that scared me. The first argument came a week later. It started over something small, it always does. My mom found the returned casserole dish in the cabinet and frowned. "Why is Mrs. Calder's plate in here?" "She brought food," I said. "While you were gone." My father looked up sharply. "You talked to the neighbors." She knocked. "And you let her in?" His voice sharpened, accusatory. "No," I said. "She left food on the step." My mom laughed uneasy. "See, people worry too much. She handled it." But my father wasn't laughing. He stared at me like he was measuring something, trying to figure out where the line had moved. "You didn't tell us," he said. "You didn't call," I answered. The room went quiet. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like that made it reasonable. "You embarrassed us." I blinked. I didn't tell her anything. That's not the point, he snapped. People noticing, people talking. My mom stepped in quickly. Let's not make this into something it's not. But it already was something. That night, I realized the rules had changed. Not for me, I'd been living by my own rules for weeks. They'd changed for my parents. They started hovering. My mom insisted on cooking meals again, setting plates in front of me like she was proving a point. My father drove me to school even though I'd walked alone for years before. He asked where I was going, who I'd be, with what time I'd be back. Not out of concern. Out of fear. He'd seen what happened when he wasn't there, and it terrified him not because I'd suffered but because I hadn't collapsed. At school I kept my head down, but something in me had hardened. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry. I felt older, like I was watching my life from a step back, noting patterns, predicting outcomes. I saw how my father's moods worked, how his voice rose when he felt small, how he dismissed things he couldn't control, how he praised obedience and punished independence. I saw how my mother smoothed everything over, turning real problems into inconveniences, rewriting history, so she never had to sit with guilt. I learned without anyone teaching me that truth was dangerous in that house. So I stopped offering it. Years passed like that. Not in a rush, not in peace either. Just a steady march of days where I did what was expected and nothing more. I got good grades. I didn't cause trouble. I learned to keep my thoughts inside until they felt too heavy. Then I let them go quietly where no one could hear. By the time I was 16, my father liked to brag about me. She's self-sufficient, he told people, always has been. He said it like it was a compliment he'd earned. I watched him say it once at a family gathering, smiling, chest puffed out. I stood there with a paper plate in my hands and realized something that settled into me like a vow. He would never admit what he'd done. Not to me, not to himself, not to anyone. That was when the idea of leaving stopped being a fantasy and became a plan. I didn't announce it, I didn't threaten it, I prepared. I took extra classes. I worked part-time. I saved money in an envelope hidden behind my dresser drawer, behind the note I still kept folded and soft with age. I read everything I could about scholarships programs, ways out that didn't require asking permission. The military wasn't the first thing I considered. But it was the first thing that made sense. Structure, clear rules, accountability. A place where showing up mattered and absence had consequences. A place where responsibility wasn't a burden dumped on a child, but a role earned and respected. When I brought it up at dinner one night, my father laughed. The military, he said, you? My mom frowned. That's so extreme. Why would you want that? I didn't say because it already lived in me. I didn't say because I'd been training since I was 12. I didn't say because I wanted to belong to something that didn't rewrite the past to feel better about itself. I want to earn my way, I said. My father waved his hand. You're being dramatic. You'll go to college. We'll help you. Help, the word tasted wrong. I can help myself, I said. That was the wrong thing to say. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. You think you're grown now? I thought about the sink, the storm, the calendar, the candle flame shaking but not going out. I think I've been grown for a while, I answered. The silence that followed was thick, dangerous. My mother cleared her throat. Let's talk about this later. Later never came. But the idea stayed. By the time I graduated high school, my path was already set. I'd learned how to make decisions without asking for approval. I'd learned how to stand alone in quiet rooms and trust my own judgment. I'd learned how to endure without applause. When I left home, my father shook my hand instead of hugging me. Don't screw this up, he said. I nodded. I won't. And I meant it not for him but for the 12-year-old girl who'd sat on a kitchen floor with a candle and taught herself not to panic. Boot camp was hard. It was supposed to be. But it wasn't new. The yelling, the pressure, the expectation that you'd perform without complaint, the demand that you control your fear and finish what you started. I'd been practicing that my whole life. The difference was this: in the Marine Corps, when someone left you alone, it was because you were trusted, not abandoned. And for the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. My parents hadn't broken me. They'd trained me. Not the way they thought, not the way they'd ever take credit for, but in the way that turns survival into strength. And one day, years later, in a uniform my father didn't understand, and a life he couldn't control, I would stand in front of him again. Not as the child he'd left behind, but as the woman he'd accidentally helped create. And that was when the real reckoning would begin. Boot camp stripped everything down to essentials: hair, sleep, privacy, excuses. It took the soft edges off people fast, and for most recruits that was the shock. For me, it felt like stepping into a room I'd already memorized in the dark. I didn't stand out at first. I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the loudest. I didn't try to be. I learned early that attention was a currency you spent carefully. Instead, I listened. I watched. I followed orders exactly as given, not because I was afraid, but because precision felt natural to me. When the drill instructors yelled, some recruits flinched, some froze, some fought back tears. I didn't do any of that. I focused on the task in front of me, the next step, the next breath, the next command. I'd learned long ago that emotions were loud and unreliable, but systems worked. Systems kept you alive. At night, lying on my rack in the dark, surrounded by the sound of other women breathing and whispering and quietly crying, memories surfaced, whether I invited them or not. The kitchen floor, the candle flame, the refrigerator hum. But instead of fear, I felt something closer to gratitude. Those nights had taught me how to stay calm when everything felt unstable. The Marine Corps noticed. Not with praise, not yet. They noticed the way you always notice competence, by leaning on it. I was given responsibility early. Small things at first. Keeping track of equipment, making sure everyone was where they were supposed to be, fixing problems before they became problems. Good initiative, one instructor muttered once, not looking at me when he said it. I tucked the words away like a ration, saved them for later. When boot camp ended, my parents came to the ceremony. I hadn't invited them enthusiastically. I'd sent the information because it felt procedural, like checking a box. They showed up wearing proud smiles, my father in a blazer he only wore when he wanted to look important. He stared at me in uniform like he was trying to reconcile two images that refused to align: the girl who'd sat silently at the kitchen table, the Marine standing at attention. "You look different," he said afterward. "Yes, sir," I replied, "because old habits die hard." My mom hugged me tight and quick. "We're so proud of you," she said, like this was a shared accomplishment. I didn't correct her. After that, the distance between us grew naturally, not with arguments or dramatic breaks, just with space. Letters went unanswered. Calls became infrequent. They told people I was busy, which was true, but not in the way they meant. I threw myself into training. I volunteered for deployments. I took on extra courses, extra responsibilities. I learned to lead quietly, effectively. I learned when to speak and when silence carried more weight. Years passed. Promotions came, not handed earned. Every step forward felt solid under my boots, like ground that wouldn't give way if I trusted it. By the time I turned 30, I was no longer thinking about my parents as often. They existed somewhere behind me, like a place you've already left and don't plan to return to. Then my phone rang one afternoon while I was stateside, sitting in an office with sunlight slanting across a desk that held my name and rank. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer. But something in me, the part that understood unfinished business, picked up. "Hi," she said too brightly. "We haven't talked in a while." No, I agreed. There was a pause. Papers rustled on her end like she'd prepared for this conversation and still didn't know how to start. "Your father isn't well," she said finally. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the ceiling. The words landed without impact. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd already accepted years ago that I wasn't responsible for managing their crises. "What does that mean?" I asked. "He's been having issues, work, stress. The doctor says he needs to slow down." I thought of him pacing the kitchen, correcting my movements, terrified of what he couldn't control. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, because it was the polite response. "He talks about you," she added quickly, "all the time." I didn't respond. "He tells people you're doing very well," she continued, "that you got your discipline from him." There it was. The familiar rewriting of history. The way he always found a way to stand at the center of outcomes he hadn't earned. "I see," I said. Another pause, this one heavier. "We were wondering," my mother began carefully, "if you might come home for a bit. Just to visit. It would mean a lot to him." Home. The word still didn't fit. I looked around my office, the framed commendations, the flag folded precisely on the shelf, the quiet order of a life built deliberately, piece by piece. "I'll think about it," I said. After I hung up, I sat there longer than necessary, not conflicted, assessing. I wasn't afraid of seeing my father again. I wasn't angry either. I felt curious. Curious to see what time had done to him. Curious to see whether the cracks I'd seen years ago had widened or been papered over. Mostly I wanted to know something simple. Did he understand now? The visit happened 3 weeks later. Their house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was chipped, the bushes untrimmed, the porch light flickered. It struck me that while I'd been building a life that required constant effort and growth, theirs had stayed still long enough to decay. My father opened the door. He'd lost weight. His shoulders slumped in a way that would have horrified him once. His eyes, still sharp, still searching, flicked down to my uniform and back up to my face. He swallowed. "You came," he said. "Yes," I replied. Inside the house smelled the same. Cleaner. Furniture rearranged but unchanged. My mother hovered, nervous, offering drinks, snacks, anything to fill the space. We sat in the living room like strangers who shared a language but not a history. Finally, my father spoke. "I hear you're doing very well," he said. "I'm doing my job," I answered. He nodded as if that confirmed something he'd been telling himself. "You know," he continued, "you always were independent, even as a kid." I looked at him then, really looked. At the man who'd left me $50 and a note. At the man who'd gasped, not because I'd been hurt, but because I'd been capable. "Yes," I said quietly, "I was." He shifted in his seat. We did our best. There it was, the final rewrite. I didn't argue, I didn't correct him, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Your best changed me." The room went still. He stared at me, trying to decide if that was praise or indictment. He never asked. And that told me everything. I left the next morning without ceremony, no hugs, no promises to call more often. As I drove away, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not relief, resolution. I understood now that closure doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it comes with clarity. And I was clear on one thing. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Because life has a way of circling back, of placing people in rooms where the past can no longer be ignored. And someday soon my father would see me again. Not in his living room. Not on his terms. But in a place where rank mattered, where records spoke, where silence carried weight. And when that moment came, there would be no room left for rewriting. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday. That was how I knew it mattered. Extraordinary news never announces itself with alarms. It arrives quietly disguised as routine, and only later do you realize it shifted the ground under your feet. I was reviewing reports when my executive officer knocked once and stepped into my office. He didn't sit. That was the first sign. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been assigned an inter-service briefing next month. Joint Command, Senior Leadership." I nodded. Briefings were constant. Joint commands were normal. None of that explained the way he was standing so straight, like he was delivering something fragile. "There's a civilian oversight component," he added. "Industry partners, defense contractors, advisory members." I looked up, and he hesitated. "One of the civilian attendees is on the advisory board. Name's on the list." He slid a folder across my desk. I didn't open it right away. I already knew. Some instincts don't fade, they sharpen. When I did open the folder, the name sat there in black type, neat and official, like it belonged anywhere but my life. My father. For a moment I felt 12 again, not scared, not small, just acutely aware of time folding in on itself. Past and present aligning with uncomfortable precision. "Any conflicts?" my XO asked carefully. I closed the folder. No. It wasn't a lie. A conflict would have implied unresolved emotion. What I felt was something else entirely: professional interest edged with inevitability. "Make sure protocol is followed," I said. "Everyone stays in their lane." "Yes, ma'am." After he left, I sat back and stared at the wall. Not at the memory of the kitchen, not at the note. At the man my father believed himself to be. He liked rooms where he could talk uninterrupted. He liked explaining systems he barely understood. He liked taking credit for outcomes shaped by other people's labor. He liked control. And now, by some twist of bureaucratic irony, he was walking into a room where control had nothing to do with volume or posture, and everything to do with rank, record, and restraint. I didn't call him. I didn't warn him. I didn't mention it to my mother, though I knew she'd know soon enough. These events always made their way into family conversations, inflated and polished before they ever reached me. Instead, I prepared the way I always did. Quietly, thoroughly. I reviewed the agenda. I memorized the seating chart. I checked protocols twice. I made sure my uniform was immaculate, not for appearance, but because discipline shows in details long before it shows in words. The day of the briefing arrived crisp and clear. The building was all glass and steel, designed to look transparent while hiding everything that mattered. Security was tight, badges checked, phones surrendered, conversations muted into professional murmurs. I arrived early. That mattered too. Standing in the conference room before it filled, I felt a familiar calm settle over me. This wasn't the kitchen. This wasn't my parents' house. This was my environment, now structured, accountable, unforgiving of pretense. People filtered in, officers, analysts, civilians in tailored suits who carried confidence like it was currency. Then my father walked in. He didn't see me at first. He was mid-sentence, gesturing slightly as he spoke to a man beside him, voice low but assured. He wore a dark suit, well cut, the kind he'd always favored when he wanted to be taken seriously. He looked older, smaller somehow, but the habits were the same. The quick scan of the room, the subtle adjustment of his tie, the way his shoulders squared as if preparing to dominate the space. Then he saw the uniform. He froze. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice the microsecond where his confidence misfired. His eyes lifted, traveled upward, stopped. Locked. For a brief moment the room faded. It was just the two of us, separated by years and silence and everything that had never been said. His mouth opened. Closed. I didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't look away. I acknowledged him the way I would any civilian, brief nod, professional distance. No recognition beyond what protocol required. He swallowed hard. I watched the color drain from his face. No, he whispered. The word barely left his lips, but I heard it. I'd heard it before. This can't be happening. The meeting began. People took their seats. Conversations cut off mid-thought. The screen at the front of the room lit up with classified markings. I took my place at the head of the table. That was when it truly landed. My father didn't gasp out loud. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He simply stared as I was introduced, name, rank, role, delivered with calm authority by an officer who had no idea he was narrating the end of a story that had begun with a folded bill and a note. My father sat very still. His hands were clenched together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Throughout the briefing, I spoke when necessary, answered questions, directed discussion. My voice didn't waver. I never once looked directly at him. I didn't need to. I could feel his attention like heat. At one point, a civilian advisor, someone my father clearly respected, leaned toward him and whispered something. My father didn't respond. He just nodded faintly, eyes still fixed forward, like any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality he was being forced to accept. This wasn't his room. These weren't his rules. And I wasn't his child. When the briefing concluded, people stood chairs, scraping softly against the floor. Conversations resumed, cautious at first, then normal. My father rose slowly. He waited. That too was new. When the room had mostly cleared, he approached. He stopped a few feet away, unsure, like he didn't know what the acceptable distance was anymore. "Ma'am," he said. The word hit him as hard as it hit me. "Yes," I replied. His eyes searched my face, desperate for something: recognition, explanation, forgiveness. Maybe all three. "I didn't know," he said. I studied him for a moment, not unkindly, just honestly. "You didn't ask," I said. The silence stretched. He cleared his throat. "I never imagined." "I know," I said. That was all. I didn't list my accomplishments. I didn't remind him of the month he left me alone. I didn't ask for an apology I already knew he couldn't give. I simply let him sit with the truth he could no longer escape. That the girl he'd underestimated had built a life so solid it now stood between him and the version of himself he preferred to remember. "I'm proud of you," he said, finally the words awkward and late. I nodded once. "Thank you," I replied, and meant it not because it fixed anything but because it closed a loop. He hesitated, then stepped back. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, quieter this time. And then he left. I remained where I was for a moment after the room emptied, the echo of his footsteps fading into the hallway. I felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Just something clean and final. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because the most powerful consequences are the ones delivered without anger, without spectacle, without cruelty. They simply exist, and you are forced to stand in front of them unarmed. After the briefing, life didn't slow down. That surprised me at first. I'd half expected something to shift, to feel lighter or heavier or different in some measurable way. But the Marine Corps doesn't pause for personal milestones. Orders still came in. Schedules still held. People still needed answers, direction, decisions made without hesitation. And I gave them. But underneath the routine, something subtle had changed. Not in me in the way the past finally stopped pressing forward. For the first time, my father knew who I was without needing me to explain it. He didn't call afterward. Neither did my mother. That silence was new, too. Not the neglectful silence of my childhood, but a careful one, like they were afraid any sound might fracture what little composure they had left. Weeks passed. Then months. I returned to deployment rotation. Different location, different climate, same long days and longer nights. In the quiet hours when sleep came in, fragments, memories still surfaced, but they didn't sting the way they used to. They felt archived, filed away under facts instead of wounds. I thought about the moment in the briefing room when my father had said, "Ma'am." It hadn't been humiliating for him. That was the part that mattered most. It had been clarifying. For both of us. One night during a late shift, my phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. Personal account. Not many people had that address. My mother. The subject line was simple, "I hope you're well." I didn't open it right away. Old instinct stirred the familiar caution, the assessment of risk. But this wasn't the house anymore. I wasn't 12. I wasn't cornered. So I opened it. She wrote the way she always did when she wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. Polite, soft, full of emotional weather reports. She said she'd heard about the briefing. She said your father was very quiet when he came home. She said he'd been thinking a lot. She said she was proud of me. Then, near the end, the truth slipped through in the way it always does. "I didn't realize how much responsibility you carried back then." Back then. Not what we did. Not what we failed to do. Just back then. I read the line twice. Then I closed the email without replying. Not because I was angry, but because the sentence was incomplete and I was done filling in other people's gaps. A few weeks later, I was asked to speak at a small leadership seminar. Nothing glamorous, no press, just a room full of junior officers and NCOs' notebooks, open eyes alert. The topic was resilience. I almost declined. Resilience is a word people like to polish until it loses its edges. They turn it into a slogan, something motivational, something easy. But the officer who asked me didn't want slogans. He wanted honesty. So I stood at the front of that room and spoke the way I always do, calm, direct, precise. I didn't talk about heroism. I talked about systems. I talked about preparation. I talked about the difference between being alone and being abandoned, and how the body learns to adapt long before the mind catches up. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't need to. Afterward, one of the younger Marines approached me. She looked nervous, hands clasped tight in front of her. "Ma'am," she said, "how do you know when you're strong? And when you're just used to surviving?" The question landed harder than she knew. I thought of the kitchen floor, the candle, the calendar dots, the note in the drawer. Then I answered her honestly. "You know when you stop confusing endurance with identity," I said. "Surviving is what you do. Strength is what you choose to build once you're safe enough to do it." She nodded slowly, like something had settled into place. That night I understood something new. The story wasn't just about my father anymore. It never really had been. It was about how neglect teaches you discipline, but love teaches you rest, and how some of us have to learn that second part later on our own terms. Another call came months after that, this time from a number I hadn't seen in years. My father. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello," I said. He cleared his throat. "It's me." "I know." There was a pause, longer than comfortable, shorter than the silences we used to keep. "I saw an article," he said finally, "about your unit." "Yes?" "They quoted you." "Yes." I didn't recognize the person they described. I closed my eyes briefly, not from pain, from understanding. "That's because you never asked to," I said. He exhaled slowly. "You're right." The admission was small, but it was real. I wanted to say, he hesitated, I wanted to say I'm sorry, for things, for not seeing. He stopped. I waited. "For assuming you'd be fine," he finished quietly. There it was. Not everything, but enough. "I was fine," I said, "and I shouldn't have had to be." Another pause. "I know," he said. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Some apologies don't undo the past, they just stop it from leaking into the future. That was enough for me. Later that year, I went back to my parents' town, not to see them, but for an unrelated ceremony nearby. They heard about it through someone else as usual. My mother asked if we could have dinner. I agreed. The house was quieter than I remembered. My father moved slower, my mother spoke softer. We ate, we talked about safe things. At the end of the night, as I stood to leave, my father said something that finally told me the truth had settled. "You know," he said, "not meeting my eyes, if I had to do it again, I'd do things differently." I looked at him. "I know," I said, "and I meant that too." Not because he'd changed the past, but because he'd finally stopped defending it. I walked out into the night air feeling steady. Complete. The child who survived alone no longer needed to prove anything. The Marine I had become didn't need validation. And the woman standing between those two versions finally understood the shape of her own strength. It wasn't forged in a single moment. It was built quietly over years, starting with a folded bill and note, and a house that taught her how to stand when no one else would. Time has a way of testing whether closure is real. It doesn't do it loudly. It waits. It circles back. It places you in situations that look familiar enough to trigger old instincts, and then watches to see what you do with them. The test came the following spring. I was stateside again, assigned to a short-term leadership rotation that put me closer to civilian oversight than usual. It meant briefings, evaluations, and inevitably public-facing events where names and titles carried weight in rooms that didn't wear uniforms. I didn't think about my parents when I accepted the assignment. That should have been the first clue that I was ready for what came next. The invitation arrived by email, forwarded through 3 layers of staff before it reached me. A formal request for attendance at a recognition ceremony tied to defense advisory contributions, civilian leadership, industry partners, oversight board members. I scanned the list once. Then again. My father's name wasn't there. Instead, it was my mother's. She'd taken a seat on a regional committee years earlier, something quiet, administrative, the kind of role that let her say she was involved without attracting too much scrutiny. I'd known about it abstractly. It had never intersected with my life. Until now. The event was optional. I could have declined without explanation. But something in me, steady, unafraid, recognized the moment for what it was. Not a confrontation, not a reckoning. A final alignment. The day of the ceremony, I arrived in dress uniform, pressed and precise. The venue was a restored civic hall, all polished wood and filtered light. People milled in clusters, voices low, laughter restrained. I saw my mother before she saw me. She stood near the back of the room speaking to 2 women. I didn't recognize her posture, carefully composed. She looked older than she had the last time we'd had dinner. Softer, less armored. When she turned and spotted me, her breath caught visibly. For a moment she didn't move. Then she smiled, the same practiced smile she'd used my entire life, designed to reassure others more than herself, and crossed the room. "You didn't say you were coming," she said, like that was my fault. "You didn't ask," I replied gently. She nodded, the smallest flicker of acknowledgement passing over her face. We sat a few rows apart during the ceremony. I listened to speeches about service and contribution, about responsibility and impact. The words floated through the room, polished and safe, stripped of the harder truths they usually required. When my name was called for a separate recognition tied to the assignment, I stood accepted, the acknowledgement returned to my seat. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Afterward, as people mingled and congratulated one another, my mother approached me again. This time she didn't lead with small talk. "I didn't know," she said quietly. I turned to face her fully. "Didn't know what I asked." "How capable you were," she said. "How much you've done." I studied her expression. There was pride there, genuine this time, but also something else, regret perhaps, or the recognition of missed moments that couldn't be reclaimed. "I've always been capable," I said, not sharply, just truthfully. She swallowed. "I see that now." We stood there for a moment, the noise of the room flowing around us. Then she surprised me. "I failed you," she said. The words were simple, unembellished, no explanations attached. I didn't respond right away. When I did, my voice was calm. "Yes," I said, "you did." She flinched, not because I'd been cruel, but because I hadn't softened it for her. And I continued, "I survived it. Both things can be true." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I respected that. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I know," I replied. That was enough. I left shortly after, not because I needed distance, but because the conversation had reached its natural end. Nothing more needed to be said, nothing needed to be proven. On the drive back, I thought about how different that exchange felt from the one with my father. He had struggled with control. My mother had struggled with responsibility. Both had struggled to see me as something other than an extension of their own lives, and both in their own way were finally learning that I existed independent of them. A week later, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, my father's script still firm, still precise. He didn't apologize again. He didn't recount the past. He wrote about something else instead. He wrote about watching the ceremony online, about seeing me stand without hesitation, speak without fear, about realizing that the month he'd left me alone hadn't taught me self-sufficiency, it had revealed it. He ended with a line that surprised me. "I thought I was shaping you. I see now that you were shaping yourself even then." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the note. Not to merge them, to mark the distance between them. One was written in haste, thoughtless and careless, born of entitlement. The other was written slowly, deliberately, born of reflection. They didn't cancel each other out. They told the story of time. The assignment ended soon after. I returned to my unit, back to the rhythms and expectations that felt like home. Life moved forward the way it always had, without pause, without spectacle. One evening, while reviewing personnel files, I came across a familiar pattern. A junior Marine, strong performance, quiet demeanor, minimal family contact. I called her into my office the next day. She stood at attention, eyes forward, waiting. "At ease," I said. She relaxed slightly. "Your record shows you've been handling a lot on your own," I said. "You don't have to." Her jaw tightened. "I'm fine, ma'am." I nodded. "I know, but you don't have to prove it here." Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition. "I want you to know," I added, "that strength isn't measured by how little you need others. It's measured by how well you build when support is available." She nodded, eyes bright but steady. When she left, I sat back and thought about how the cycle had changed. I wasn't the child anymore. I wasn't even the one seeking acknowledgement. I was the one creating environments where absence didn't become abandonment, where responsibility didn't arrive before care. That night I slept deeply. Not because the past was erased, but because it was finally settled in its proper place, behind me. And for the first time since I was 12, I didn't dream of empty houses or flickering candles. I dreamed of open doors, of rooms filled with steady light, of a future that didn't require survival to exist. There are moments that feel like endings only because we've been taught to expect fireworks. Apologies shouted, tears spilled, doors slammed or reopened, people hugging in the rain while music swells. That wasn't how this ended. It ended quietly on a morning that looked like any other. I was up early, running before sunrise, the air cool enough to sting my lungs. My pace was steady, familiar. Each step landed exactly where I expected it to. That's how I knew I'd changed, not because the past no longer existed, but because it no longer interrupted my stride. When I finished, I sat on the tailgate of my truck and checked my phone. One new message. From my father. Just a photo. No caption. It was of the old house, the one I'd grown up in. Beige siding, trimmed bushes, the porch light replaced, fresh paint on the door. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Not because I missed it. Because I recognized it for what it was, an attempt at restoration. He wanted me to see that he was fixing something, that he understood finally that neglect leaves marks even when the structure stays standing. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again. Then I put the phone away without responding. Not because I was punishing him. Because some things don't need acknowledgement to be true. Later that week I visited my grandmother. She was smaller now, her hands thinner, her movements slower. But her eyes were the same sharp knowing, always 2 steps ahead of whatever story someone thought they were telling. She looked at me for a long moment after I walked in, head tilted, a smile pulling at one corner of her mouth. "You're settled," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. She nodded, good. We sat at her kitchen table drinking tea. Real tea, hot, sweetened, just right. The kind of simple comfort I hadn't known how to ask for when I was 12. "You know," she said casually, "I tried to come by that month." I didn't react, I waited. "Your father told me you were at a camp," she continued. "Said you were busy, independent, didn't want company." I smiled faintly. That sounds like him. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I would have come anyway if I'd known. "I know," I said. That mattered more than anything else she could have said. When I left her house, I drove past the old neighborhood without slowing down. I didn't need to see it again. I already knew what it represented. Not abandonment. Preparation. That's the word people don't like, because it implies purpose, intention, design. My parents hadn't intended to prepare me for anything. They'd intended to disappear for a month and return to a life unchanged. But intent doesn't decide outcome. Actions do. And that month, quiet, frightening, lonely, had taught me lessons no one else could have taught me. How to manage fear without feeding it. How to solve problems without waiting for permission. How to exist without validation. Those lessons followed me into every room I ever entered afterward. Into training. Into leadership. Into moments where people looked to me because I didn't flinch. I never thanked my parents for that month. I never needed to. Gratitude is for gifts. This was something else. Months later, I stood in a different room, smaller, quieter, administering an oath to a group of new Marines. Their faces were a mix of nerves and determination, the way mine had been once. One of them caught my eye, a young woman, straight posture, hands steady. After the ceremony, she lingered. "Ma'am," she said, voice low, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." She hesitated. "Do you ever feel like you became strong because you had to, and you're not sure who you'd be otherwise?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Strength is a response, not an identity." She frowned slightly. "You're not strong because you suffered," I continued. "You're strong because you chose what to build afterward." Her shoulders eased, just a fraction. That was enough. That night, alone in my quarters, I opened the drawer where I kept the note. The original one. The airline itinerary, the blue ink, the sentence that had changed everything. "We're going to Europe for a month." I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases the way I had 1,000 times before. Then I did something I'd never done. I let myself feel it. Not the fear. Not the hunger. Not the loneliness. The clarity. That was the gift inside the abandonment, the moment I realized I was on my own, and that being on my own didn't mean being powerless. I folded the note again and placed it back in the drawer. Not as evidence. As history. Somewhere out there, my parents were living with the knowledge of what they'd done, not punished, not forgiven into comfort. Just known. And that was enough. Because the truth is this. They didn't ruin my life. They revealed it. They didn't weaken me. They showed me what I was capable of without them. And in doing so, they lost the only thing that truly mattered, the right to define who I became. I became a Marine. I became a leader. I became a woman who can stand in any room in any silence and trust herself completely. Not because I was left alone, but because I survived it and then chose something better. That's how the story ends. Not with revenge. Not with tears. But with a woman who no longer needs either. Or 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 needs either.